The night my son came into the world, the temperature outside was 11 degrees. I know because I was lying on the shoulder of Route 9, 3 weeks before my due date, watching my own breath disappear into the dark, thinking, not tonight. Please. Not on this road. The car had spun on black ice. I was 31 years old, 7 months and 1 week pregnant, alone in the car because my husband Marcus was already at the hospital. He'd gone ahead to park, and I was supposed to be right behind him. That detail will matter later. The paramedic who reached me first had a blue thermos clipped to his belt. I remember staring at it while he talked. I don't remember what he said. I remember the thermos. My son was born 47 minutes after that ambulance reached St. Augustine's. He was small. He was loud. He was perfect. And when I called my parents from the recovery room, shaking, tube still in my arm, to tell them I needed someone, what they said first is something I still think about. Not what they said second. What they said first. I'll get to that. Welcome to Calm Revenge Tales. This channel is for the people who kept showing up for someone while another person took the credit, and then watched the universe sort the receipts. Drop where you're listening from in the comments, and subscribe if you're staying. Let's go. I need to tell you about my grandfather first, because nothing that happened makes sense without him. His name was Edmund. Ed. To everyone who loved him. He was 74 when this story begins. And he had the hands of a man who had never once hired out work he could do himself. Big knuckles. Permanently stained with something, grease or garden soil or wood finish, depending on the season. He wore the same 4 flannel shirts on rotation. Not because he couldn't afford others. Because they fit right and he saw no argument for change. He drove a 1998 Ford F-150, the color of old mustard. And he kept it tuned so well it could have made another 200,000 miles without complaint. He spent almost no money on himself. He kept a small spiral notebook, the kind with the wire coil at the top, the ones that cost $1.19. And he wrote things in it with a mechanical pencil he'd owned since 1987. The notebook went everywhere with him. In his breast pocket, over his heart, every single day. He had built a modest life and a careful fortune that almost no one in our family understood the dimensions of. He didn't talk about money. He talked about what money was for. $1 saved in silence, he told me once, when I was about 17 and complaining about something. I don't even remember what. Is $1 that works for you instead of against you. I didn't know what he meant then. I thought it was just something old men said. It was not just something old men said. The arrangement between Grandpa Ed and my parents, his daughter, my mother Linda, and her husband Ray, had been in place for years. They lived 40 minutes from him. They were supposed to check in on him twice a week, drive him to his cardiology appointments, make sure the house was holding up through the winters. In exchange, they received a monthly envelope. Not a small one. There was no contract. That was the flaw. It was right there, and none of us saw it as one, because we thought family was the contract. One more thing about Grandpa Ed. Before I go further, he showed me the notebook once, just a glimpse, and he said, I wrote down everything that happened. Every cent. Every date. So nobody has to take anybody's word for it. I thought he was talking about the past. When this story starts, I was not doing well. I had a freelance consulting practice that was technically alive and functionally on a ventilator. Marcus worked in logistics. We had a small apartment, 840 square feet, which I know precisely because I measured it once trying to figure out if we could add a crib without removing the dining table. We could, if the chairs faced a specific direction. I was tired, I was stretched, and I was 3 weeks from having a baby. I almost didn't go to the hospital that night when Marcus called and said, come, they have a room ready. I almost said, can we wait until morning? I went. I've thought about that a lot since. So, my parents. When I called from the recovery room, 43 minutes after Eli was born, I had one hand holding the phone and one hand holding a nurse's wrist because I didn't want her to leave yet. My voice was not steady. I told them, emergency delivery Route 9, everyone okay, baby is here, I need someone to come. My mother said, is Marcus there? I said yes. she said. Well, then you're covered. There was a pause. My father said in the background, We're not driving in this weather, Nora. That was it. That was the first thing. Not how is the baby? Not how are you? Not we're leaving now. We're not driving in this weather. Marcus sat in that room with me all night and didn't say anything about it because he knew there was nothing useful to say. He held Eli and I watched his face do something I'd never seen it do before, this specific stillness, and I thought, okay, this is enough. This is enough right here. The weather was 11 degrees and the roads were bad. I know. I don't need them to have come. I needed them to want to. There is a difference between those two things that I cannot explain to someone who doesn't already know it. 4 days later, I brought Eli home to 840 square feet with the crib in the corner and the chairs facing east. 2 days after that, Grandpa Ed knocked on the door. He was wearing the red flannel. He had a paper bag from the bakery 2 towns over that had a specific almond croissant I had mentioned liking once, 2 years ago. He also had his notebook in his breast pocket. He stood in the doorway and looked at Eli and Marcus's arms and he said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, He's got the Kowalski jaw. That's good. That jaw'll serve him. He stayed 4 hours. He washed every dish in the sink before he left. He didn't ask if it was okay. He just did it. And when he was putting on his coat at the door, he said, You're going to need more room soon. We'll figure that out. I assumed he meant in the abstract. The way people say we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I was wrong about that too. What happened over the next 18 months is the part that's hard to explain without sounding like I'm asking for credit. So I'll just say what happened plainly. My parents stopped driving Grandpa Ed to his cardiology appointments. Not dramatically. It faded. One cancellation became a pattern, became an assumption that someone else was handling it. The someone else was me. I drove 40 minutes each way, twice a month, with a newborn in the back seat, to take my grandfather to a cardiologist in a building that charged $11 for parking. I paid the $11. I kept the receipts in a folder because I am the kind of person who keeps folders, and because Grandpa Ed had once said, Write down everything. My mother's explanation, when I finally asked, was that they were going through a lot. I did not ask what specifically. I paid the cardiology copays when he was short. 3 times over those 18 months. $40, $60, $85. Small amounts. I wrote them down. Marcus and I lost a contract that year because I missed 2 deadline windows being at appointments. I didn't tell him why, exactly. He knew. He didn't push. My parents, during this same stretch, told anyone who asked that they were Grandpa Ed's primary caretakers. They said it at Christmas. They said it at the neighborhood association meeting where Ed was being recognized for 40 years of membership. They told their friends it was a sacrifice, but family was family. I heard this third hand, from my cousin Petra. I thought about saying something at Christmas. I opened my mouth once and then closed it, because Eli was sitting on Grandpa Ed's knee and laughing at the paper crown from a cracker, and I decided that moment was worth more than the argument. I let it go. I want to be clear. I don't think my parents are evil people. I think they are people who found a story about themselves that was comfortable, and they chose to live in it. A lot of people do that. It doesn't make the story true. Grandpa Ed and I had a project during this period. It started small. He had boxes, actual cardboard boxes in his back bedroom, of receipts, invoices, and handwritten ledgers going back to the 1970s. His father's business records. His own business records. A lifetime of paper. He wanted it organized. Digitized if possible. He said the word digitized the way someone might say teleported to Mars, aware it was real, uncertain of the physics. So every other Sunday, when I brought Eli for a visit, I'd set the baby in his bouncer in the corner, and we'd work through a box together. Ed would tell me what something was. I'd photograph it, log it, label it. We made a shared drive. I had to show him 3 times what that meant, and he wrote the instructions in the notebook. He named the folder Kowalski Record. What actually happened? I thought it was an old man's sentimentality. There it is again. Me being wrong. One Sunday, maybe 14 months into this project, he looked at a document for a long time and then said, "Some people think I don't know what's going on. I know what's going on." He tapped the notebook. "It's all in here." He said it the same way he said everything, flat, plain, like a sentence about weather. But he looked at me when he said it in a way that wasn't casual. I almost asked him what he meant. I handed him the next envelope of receipts instead, because Eli was starting to fuss, and the moment passed. If you've ever quietly carried something heavier than your budget for someone who deserved it, and done it with no audience and no ledger except your own conscience, comment the word flannel below, and subscribe, because this does not end where you think. 14 months into the Sunday project, I found something. I had gone to Ed's house alone. Marcus had Eli, and I was working through the last box in the back bedroom. Near the bottom, under a stack of 1980s tax returns, there was a manila envelope. It was sealed. It had one word on the front, written in mechanical pencil. Nora. My name. I held it for probably 30 seconds. It had weight to it. Not heavy but not empty. I put it back. I put it exactly where I found it, under the 1983 returns, in the same position, and I closed the box. I don't know if it was the right thing to do. I know it was what I did. I finished logging the rest of that box. I labeled the folder. I drove home. The following Sunday, when I arrived with Eli, Grandpa had opened the door before I could knock. He looked at me for a moment. Not long, not dramatically, and then he said, "You'll drive me Thursday. Cardiology." Not a question. "Of course," I said. He nodded once and stepped back to let us in. He never mentioned the envelope. The last good evening was a Thursday in October. I'd driven him to the appointment. Clean bill of relative health, his words, which he seemed to regard as mildly irritating, as though his body was taking too long to complete something. He'd made that joke before. I made the same face I always made, the one that said, "That's not funny." He let me. We stopped at his house after. I made soup from what was in his kitchen, which turned out to be a reasonable chicken situation with too many carrots and not enough salt. He salted it heavily and said nothing about the base deficit, which from Ed was high praise. Eli was home with Marcus that night. It was quiet. We ate. He told me, unprompted, about a summer in 1971 when he'd driven his truck from Michigan to New Mexico for a reason he described only as better scenery. I laughed. He washed his own mug after dinner, dried it, hung it on the specific hook by the window where it always lived. Brown mug, white interior, a crack along the handle that had been there so long it had become part of the mug. "Same time Sunday?" I said at the door. He said, "We're almost through the boxes." I said, "Then we'll find more boxes." He made a sound that was approximately a laugh. He went inside. I drove home. The call came Sunday morning, before I had left. I knew before I answered. I don't know how. I just knew. He had gone quietly, the doctor said. In the night. His heart had been patient with him for a long time, and then it was finished. I sat in the kitchen for a few minutes. Then I drove to his house because I needed to see it. The mug was on the hook. Washed. Dried. The notebook was on the kitchen table, closed, with the mechanical pencil laid across it like a bookmark. The light over the stove was on. The one he left on whenever he was expecting someone. I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Do we know if there's a will?" The funeral was at St. Michael's, which Ed had attended without notable enthusiasm for 40 years, a fact he had described as a reasonable arrangement between a man and his community. My mother wore black and cried at specific moments, when the pastor spoke, when Ed's name appeared in the program, when anyone with a camera was nearby. She held my father's arm. She spoke to the receiving line about sacrifice, about being there in his final years, about how much he had leaned on them. People nodded. I stood near the back with Marcus and Eli, who was wearing a small gray blazer that made him look like a tiny middle manager. I said nothing. I watched. There was one moment, near the end of the receiving line, where my cousin Petra looked at my mother and then looked at me. and I saw her face do something small and private. A recalculation. She didn't say anything either. File it. As the reception was ending, a woman I didn't recognize came and stood near me. Small, gray-suited, professional in the particular way of people whose profession involves other people's worst days. She pressed a card into my hand. Margaret Faltz, attorney at law. She leaned slightly toward me and said, very quietly, his instructions were that you be contacted first. I think you'll understand why, after Thursday. She gave one small nod. Not a performance, just a confirmation. Then she was gone. The reading was on a Thursday. Margaret Faltz's office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown, and it smelled like old paper and radiator heat. There were 4 chairs arranged in front of her desk. My parents were already seated when Marcus and I arrived. My mother had her hands folded in her lap. She looked composed in the way of someone who has already mentally moved the furniture. As we sat down, she said, not to me, not to anyone specific, just to the room. I just hope he didn't make this complicated. Just loud enough. Margaret opened a folder. She said Grandpa Ed's estate was more substantial than most family members had been aware. The number she named was not obscene. It was careful. It was the result of decades of flannel shirts and a $1.19 notebook. Then she said, he had kept detailed records of all financial transactions with family members over the past 11 years. The monthly envelopes to my parents, which they had received as compensation for caregiving, were documented in those records not as gifts. They were documented as advances against the estate. Margaret read one line from the document. Ed's own words, written in the handwriting I knew from the Sunday Project. Linda and Ray received fair compensation for a service that was not performed. I do not hold a grudge. I hold a ledger. It was the exact phrase, the exact construction, the same words my mother had once used, at Christmas, 2 years before he died. Family doesn't hold grudges, Ed. He had written her answer in his will before she said it to his face. My mother said, that is not, he would not have, someone influenced him. Her voice was rising. She said my name like it was a verdict. She said that I had spent those 18 months manipulating an old man, that the Sunday Project was a scheme, that the drives to cardiology were a long-game performance designed to cut her out of what was rightfully. Margaret said, very evenly, Mrs. Halstead, the document predates your daughter's involvement by several years. Silence. I stood up. I didn't have a speech. I had one thing. I said. He washed his mug the night before he died. Dried it. Put it on the hook. He left the light on because he was always expecting someone to come. I looked at my mother. He was still waiting. I walked out. Marcus was half a step behind me. I didn't look back. My parents contested. It took 8 months and cost them more in legal fees than the adjusted portion they were arguing over. Once the advances were subtracted from their share, their attorney was good. Margaret Faltz was better, and had 81 pages of documented evidence in a spiral notebook. They lost. The public version of my mother, the devoted daughter, the primary caregiver, did not survive the conference room. Because the conference room had dates. It had receipts. It had 11 years of a man writing down what happened in mechanical pencil. 2 people who had believed my mother called me separately in the months after. My cousin Petra was the first. She said, I'm sorry I didn't ask better questions. I said, he made it easy to believe the comfortable story. That wasn't your fault. I believed that. It cost me nothing not to. My father has not called. I don't wait for it. The Sunday Project is finished now, in a way neither Ed nor I originally intended. The digitized records, his father's business, his own, the full Kowalski archive, became the foundation of a small financial literacy program at the public library in his town. It runs 8 weeks in the fall. It teaches people how to read a document, keep a record, understand what an advance means versus a gift. It is called the Edmund Kowalski Practical Record. 11 people went through it the first year. 33 the second. The mug is on a shelf in my kitchen now. Brown. White interior. The crack along the handle. The notebook. The last one, the one with the mechanical pencil across it, is in a glass box on the same shelf. I did not open it until the estate was fully settled. He had written on the last page, "Drive Nora. Sunday project, finished. House settled. Mug hers." For lines. That was Grandpa Ed. I would give back every cent to have one more Thursday drive. One more bowl of over-carrot soup. One more argument about whether the crack in the mug was structural or cosmetic. He would say cosmetic. I would say structural. He would salt his soup and let me be right because he knew I needed to be right sometimes. The one thing I know, the truest thing in all of this, is that showing up for someone quietly, without an audience, without a contract, is never wasted. It isn't always seen in the moment, but it is always recorded somewhere. Call the person who once showed up for you while you still can. You know who I mean. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you're staying. I'll see you in the next one.